Hold on.
So how's everybody doing tonight?
All right, I'm going to give you the numbers.
That good, huh?
That good.
I'm doing well. This is Larry.
Hi, Larry. Yeah. Hi, Sam.
Good evening. Sam has a video and a microphone.
Yes. Amazing, isn't it?
I know there was a virus on your computer, I remember, for a while where you could only do either or.
1118.
Yeah. But she can't use the computer.
9901. Passcode is 121.
It's all. Yeah. All right. There we go. I thought we were going to have class with whoever was on with Suzanne for a little bit.
Well, they just need the dial-in number.
Yeah, there you are. Hey, so tonight, mostly we're going to talk about the big three of the prophets, or at least the big three books of the prophets. They are sort of in chronological order, although many of the prophets' books are not arranged that way. But Isaiah, or at least first Isaiah, comes before Jeremiah historically, and Jeremiah comes a little bit before Ezekiel. Isaiah actually is two books. It's 66 chapters, and the first 39 chapters are the 8th century before the Common Era prophet Isaiah. Chapter 40 through 66 are by an unknown prophet during the exile, and some biblical scholars suggest that that actually is divided into two parts, two separate people. But we're mostly going to look at Isaiah the first tonight. He lives under 4 different Judean kings, the last of which is Hezekiah, who almost miraculously survives the Assyrian invasion. And Isaiah has a really messianic vision, right? You know, you get famous verses from Isaiah: nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Right? Chapter 2 is definitely a messianic vision, but it also suggests that Jews have a special role to play in that we're supposed to be a light unto the nations. Maybe the Jewish people are the ones who bring the moral law of God into the world. As I've suggested before, this could be the part of the reason why anti-Semitism is so widespread. God's moral law is not always very popular. I assume everybody here is for it. I won't take a show of hands, but probably everybody here believes in the basic moral law, right? Well, there's always somebody. There's always somebody who's against it. And you can't very well get back at God, so why not get back at the messengers? And that's, one reason why I think that anti-Semitism is so widespread, particularly in places where there aren't even any Jews living. It's a very strange thing. By the way, the word Messiah literally means anointed. In Hebrew, the word is Mashiach. Right? And what we used to do was, when we had kings of Israel, they would be anointed with oil. Apparently, that was a fairly common coronation ritual back then. And so, the idea is that the Redeemer will be anointed by God, the ultimate Redeemer, and bring salvation to the Jewish people and to the world. there's a lot of interest in this idea of a Messiah. It would solve a lot of very serious problems in the world. Doesn't seem to happen so easily. In one of my other classes, I mentioned that the Messiah seems to be the one who does not come. And that's the way it is so far. But you never know. Tomorrow could be different. Next year could be different. Let's hope next year is different from this year. Right? Right, Ashley? Yeah. Now, I suggested 2 other chapters for you to read, to emphasize certain other things in Isaiah. Anybody here read chapter 3 this week?
Mm-hmm. I did.
Yeah. Okay. What's the point of that
Did my
chapter?
homework.
Yes. So what's the point of chapter 3? What did you get from that?
My notes here.
I'm just going to help and put up a few verses on the screen. Here's how. Well, this is chapter 1, right, of the sinful nation. Right. But let's look at chapter 3. Right. Okay. So
Yes.
just randomly around verse 8. Here's where you get some of the message. Jerusalem has stumbled, Judah has fallen, because by word and deed they insult the Lord, defying his majestic glance. What do you think really insults the Lord? What's the most insulting thing to God, according to the prophets?
I don't know.
Anyone?
Mm-mm.
Not listening to him.
Hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy. Yeah. And how did that hypocrisy manifest itself in ancient Israel?
Well, saying one thing and doing the opposite.
Well, give me an example.
Well, the golden calf.
Okay, well, the golden calf is long before Isaiah.
I understand that, but it's an
Yeah.
example of hypocrisy.
Yeah, okay. But what kinds of hypocrisy are Isaiah and some of the other prophets appalled by? Right? Think the temple, right?
Mhm.
People show how observant they are, how holy they are, how faithful to God they are by bringing their sacrifices to the temple. Now, the prophets are not opposed to bringing sacrifices. It's just, that's part of the religion in that period. But
Well-
what's the problem with that?
Well, the thing is, people think that the bigger the sacrifice, the more, perfect what they bring is, the holier they are. And that's not necessarily true.
That's correct. And the worst of it is, going home from that and oppressing the poor, taking from the needy. Right? So here, how do they insult the Lord? Their partiality in judgment accuses them. They show preference to the rich. They avow their sins like Sodom. They do not conceal them. Woe to them, for ill have they served themselves. Hail the just man, he shall fare well, he shall eat the fruit of his works. Woe to the wicked man, for he shall fare ill, as his hands have dealt, so shall it be done by him. Right? the Lord will bring this charge against the elders and officers of his people. It is you who have ravaged the vineyard. That which was robbed from the poor is in your houses. How dare you crush my people and grind the faces of the poor, says my Lord God of hosts. That's the worst thing you can do. Injustice, oppression, stealing from the poor. Right? So God wants justice, and if you don't provide it, then bad things will happen to you because you're not living up to God's standard. If you oppress the weak and the poor. That's the big lesson of this segment. Right? The prophet doesn't show any favoritism towards the women either, especially the rich women who, they have all this finery. But in that day, in the bad day to come, my Lord will strip off the finery of the anklets, the fillets, and the crescents, the eardrops, the bracelets, the veils, et cetera, all your chatsy stuff, right? The nose rings, the festive robes, et cetera, right? And then instead of perfume, there shall be rot. Instead of an apron, a rope. Instead of a diadem of beaten work, a shorn head. Instead of a rich robe, a girding of sackcloth. Her men shall fall by the sword, her fighting manhood, etc. Right? In battle. The gates shall lament and mourn, and she shall be emptied. She shall sit on the ground. Right? So, Isaiah is certainly not the only prophet who brings this message. It's really the major point of the prophet Amos, who, although he lives in Judea in the southern kingdom, he goes to talk in the northern kingdom in a time of great economic prosperity. But that prosperity was not equally shared, right? And the rich are so generous and scrupulous with religious matters, but not so exacting about fairness with the poor. And the prophet says the mistreatment of human beings makes God more angry than anything else. Doesn't matter what rituals you observe, they won't buy off God. Right? Any other comments or reactions to this view in chapter 3 of Isaiah? Okay. Well, I want to move along to chapter 6 of Isaiah. Okay. Chapter 6 is a very different piece, and it's sort of the installation ceremony to prophecy for Isaiah. What happens to Isaiah in chapter 6? Anyone know?
Yeah.
Yes.
I did read it.
Yeah. So what happens to him?
I don't know, my brain is frozen.
Well, you have to get in line for that, Sam.
Yeah.
He has a vision.
He has a vision. What kind of vision?
Oh, the angels and the seraphs stood.
Yeah, he has a vision of the angels and the seraphs around God's throne. Yeah. So this chapter 6 is about mystical experience and the idea that it might be available to some people. Now, I don't want to ask here, but if any of you have ever had something that resembled a mystical experience, email me and let me know, because that's one of my special interests. It was sort of what propelled me to do my doctoral project in a curriculum on Jewish mysticism, and to write a book about that. And in the introduction, I mentioned that, part of the reason I got into this was that so many of my congregants would come to me and they'd say, well, I had this and that experience and I can't describe it and I can't explain it. Rabbi, am I crazy? Well, no, you're not crazy. I wouldn't have told them they were crazy anyway, because I'm just not that kind of guy. But still, I could have said, yeah, there's medicines for that now. Right? But I've heard so many of those experiences. It doesn't establish it as a fact, but I've come to believe that many of those experiences are very real. And Isaiah describes something that, certainly for him is very real. It's kind of a cosmic parallel to the temple as it was in the Jerusalem of his day. And by the way, the rabbis assigned this chapter as the Haftarah for the week when we read in the Torah, in the book of Exodus, about the 10 Commandments. So by making that parallel, the rabbis made it clear that they saw this as an individual experience of God's presence, of revelation, maybe parallel to what the Israelite people went through at Sinai. So the opening verse, and I'll pull this up so everybody can see it. Right? So this suggests that, the skirts of God's robe filled the temple. So it's kind of like being in the temple courts, right? And he has this ecstatic vision of God. By the way, there are other places in the book of Kings, in the book of Daniel, where there are scenes of God's throne. So this wasn't totally unique to Isaiah. But in the first 4 verses, you see the word fill, right? The skirts of his robe filled the temple. His presence fills the earth. The house kept filling with smoke. All right. So it's like you're being filled with the presence of God. Right? So these angels pay tribute to God, and Isaiah has an overwhelming sense of his own impurity in this realm. This is, the presumption of the mystic is they're not going to accept any impurity up there in that, cosmic realm, right? And he says, I'm lost. I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips, but my own eyes have beheld the Lord, the King, the Lord of hosts. And so it's like, surely something bad is going to happen to me. And so one of the seraphs flew to him with this live coal, touched it to his, and I don't get this part. He took it with a pair of tongs. You mean angels need tongs to take coal? Hot coal? I guess. But I thought angels didn't have to do that. So anyway, he touched it to Isaiah's lips and says, now that this has touched your lips, your guilt shall depart and your sin be purged away. Okay? And so now he can kind of withstand this experience and get a message that he's going to bring back to the people. He hears God's voice saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And Isaiah says, here am I, send me. Hineni. Here I am. And God said, go say to that people, hear indeed, but do not understand. See indeed, but do not grasp. Right? It's it's interesting that, he gets the word, but the prophecy is that they won't get the word. They won't get the idea. Dull that people's mind, stop its ears, seal its eyes, lest seeing with its eyes and hearing with its ears, it also grasp with its mind and repent and save itself. In other words, it's like, no, let them know what's going to happen, but just say to them, you all are not going to understand this. You're not going to get better. Well, actually, of course, they do get better in the time of Isaiah and a little bit later. Now, Isaiah, other than that live coal, there's nothing that prepares him for this experience. Right? It's just forced upon him. He does go to the temple in Jerusalem, but here he's clearly raised up to a higher place. This is the mystical experience of Isaiah. Its goal is just to prepare him to receive and to transmit God's word. Going back up for a moment, all right? Now, this portion, verse 3, you have this in every single morning and afternoon service.
Right.
In Jewish prayer,
Mhm.
right? Holy, holy,
Kadosh,
holy,
Kadosh.
the Lord of hosts, his presence fills all the earth, right? What do you think the angels mean when they say God's presence fills all the earth?
I don't know. I mean, I read this last week
what?
after
I'm
class,
not
and I
sure.
reread
I'm
it
not
today, and
sure.
I still
I know,
don't.
and any of us, your guess is as good as mine, right? But there's something, at least in this moment, that seems visible, that God's presence becomes very real. Right?
Aren't we supposed to believe that God is everywhere?
Well, yes, that's what I was taught. But if God is everywhere, why is he in this throne room?
Well, that's one of the questions that has been asked all along.
Yes. And do we have an answer for it? Not
No.
really. Not really.
I mean,
Right.
you can make big pronouncements, but then when you try to understand them, doesn't always work.
Okay, so this is one of the things about mystical experience, okay? If you were to have such an experience, you would probably struggle to be able to explain it. And that is, I think, part of what's happening here. And we'll see a little bit, later in Ezekiel, who's, has a very well fleshed out, expression of what he sees. But does that necessarily explain it? Not really. Right? But if God's presence fills all the earth, what that suggests, at least, is the possibility that God has a specific presence. Right? Now, this is what we call anthropomorphism, talking about God in human terms, as if God were a human being. And the prophets do this a lot, right? The prophets attribute what we would think of as human feelings to God, as well as human behavior, right? For the prophets, God has tremendous concern for his people and certainly for all people, but God, it's if you say that God cares, for some people that's a problem, because caring is a human emotion, right? And yet God seems to care. That's the expression of the prophets, right? Also, found in the Torah and variety of places in Scripture, in the Tanakh, right? So, if any of this talking about God as if God were a person, if any of this troubles you, you're in very good company. Maimonides, other medieval philosophers wrestled with these issues. These kinds of expressions are very difficult to deal with, but it's also very difficult to eliminate them from Judaism. Okay? Let me see if I can get back here. Okay. Comments or questions before we go further?
To me, it seems like the anthropomorphism here really skirts the golden calf issue, the making of some kind of an image to worship. Just not quite the same, but in the same fashion.
Yeah. If God has a visible presence, isn't that what we were told we weren't supposed to have? Right? And yet, people have visions in which, they experience a physical presence of God. Right? And I guess we're just not supposed to understand that as all of God, but maybe just as an experience of God's presence.
Rabbi, do you think the physical presence of God is inadvertently helped along by synagogues that have, well, I'm thinking of the synagogue that I grew up in. There was a sort of a double ceiling, and there was a light that came down in the middle, and all the kids and probably some of the adults thought that was God looking down on this. And clearly the architect had something like that in mind. And I'm just thinking about that, and I'm thinking, like, isn't that sort of the opposite of what we're really supposed to do? And yet it's done all over.
Yeah. It is a problem. And I don't have an easy answer for it. I think a lot of our synagogue architecture is intended to evoke that kind of feeling, even though it doesn't outright declare this is God, right? Because people wouldn't buy that, right? But it certainly tries to evoke a certain presence. I mean, just think of, you've been in the, all of you who've been at Beth Yeshurun have been in the Barg Sanctuary, right? Which back in the day was even more imposing than it is now, right? They've tried to bring it down a little bit, narrow it down a little bit, but it was very deliberately a cathedral style sanctuary to evoke at least a sense of God's grandeur without making a picture of God imposing as much as possible the grand size of the place evoked some of the only way I can describe the feeling is God is up there and you are down here, right? Rabbi Malev was up there, and those of you who remember Rabbi Malev, you'll also remember, that if anybody talked during his sermon, he would give them what was, widely known as the look of death. And yeah, God help you if that look was fixed on you, regardless of your age. Nobody dared to stare back at him. But yeah, we're up there, God and maybe the rabbis and the cantor. You are down there. That's what a cathedral style sanctuary does. And that's, and in smaller synagogues, some architects try to evoke that presence in a little different way.
Well, I'm talking about a synagogue that was built, at least a sanctuary, after World War II. And I think we could have a whole separate course on why the presence of God may have been added at that time. As a matter of fact, I think Bernice Halberton has talked about
I think
synagogue
there's another
architecture.
factor at work, which was very important for Beth Yeshurun in 1961 when our building was initially built. I was in it in the 60s, not so long after it had been built. And I think that, like many fairly grand style synagogues, the unspoken message was, we Jews have now made it in America. Look at our synagogue. Look how big and special it is.
Don't you think that was for the architecture of synagogues for a long time before the world wars? I mean, if you look at places in New York, some of those were there long before we
And
came
some
on the
of
scene down
those,
here.
the motivation was the same.
Right.
Right?
But
If you think about, Temple Emmanuel in New York City, or the
Central
Spanish
Synagogue.
Portuguese Synagogue, Shirith Israel,
Yeah.
on Central Park West. Yeah, they're very much the same kind of motivation, I think. But a lot of our synagogues, and definitely Beth Yeshurun, I think, we just sort of have to accept our past and deal with the future. But I believe that that's why people built grandiose synagogues, for those two reasons. Number one, to evoke a God who was more transcendent than immanent. In other words, farther away from us rather than necessarily close in, right? And of course, if you were a smaller synagogue, you tried to evoke more of the sense of, close in, right? And then the other motivation was, look how nicely we've made it here. Look at how we can afford such a big shul, such a great building. Right? Now, the people I grew up with in Oklahoma City were so envious of some of the churches in Oklahoma City. They couldn't afford to build a big place like that, but they wanted to make sure that it was big enough so that, we were, we weren't so many in Oklahoma City. We couldn't afford and didn't need, by the way, a huge mammoth synagogue, but, they made sure it was, as nice as any church in town. Yep. So, from Isaiah, let's go to Jeremiah. Right? Jeremiah lives about the year 600 before the Common Era, right at the end of the first temple period. And I suggested to you the first chapter of Jeremiah. Okay. Anybody have anything to say about the first chapter of Jeremiah? While I pull it up here.
Edit.
Oh, by the way, just so you know, this is a resource that any of you can access if you want to read a Jewish text. It's called Sefaria. In Hebrew, Sifriya is library. So this is like a mega library, all kinds of texts, both in Hebrew and in English, many, many texts translated. Okay.
Thank you for telling us that, Rabbi.
I'm just pulling it up here on the screen because it's convenient and you don't all have to go looking for your Tanakh, right? So here's the words of Jeremiah. The word of the Lord came to him in the days of King Josiah in the 13th year of his reign, and throughout the days of the next king, and then to the next king, King Zedekiah, when Jerusalem went into exile. And what did God say to him in that initial visit? God says, I picked you.
Selected you.
It was my plan to have you be a prophet. Okay. And what does Jeremiah say here in verse 6? It says, I'm still a boy. I don't know how to speak. Remember, who said that before? I'm not a speaker.
Moses.
When God called
old
us.
Moshe.
Yeah,
Sure.
Moses
Yeah.
said, I'm this little speech defect or whatever. And, did that get him out of it? It did
No.
not. And doesn't get Jeremiah out of it either. God says to him, don't say that. Oh, I'm still a boy. You're going to go where I send you. You're going to speak what I tell you. And do not be afraid of them, because I'm with you. Now, this doesn't help Jeremiah sometimes because Jeremiah gets thrown into the dungeon. He gets mistreated in all kinds of ways. Right? The Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth. That's an interesting kind of experience, right?
Mhm.
I don't know. Would you rather have the hot coal or the hand of God? Right?
Yeah.
God says, herewith I put my words into your mouth. I appoint you today over nations and kingdoms to uproot and pull down, destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Right? And God says, what do you see, Jeremiah? It's like he's giving him a back screen, right? And Jeremiah says, I see a branch of an almond tree. The word shaked is an almond tree. But shaked also in the verb form, it means watchful. Maybe you have to be real careful and watchful with almond trees. I don't know. But that's the connection. God says, you're right. That's what you've seen. I am watchful to bring my word to pass. And he asks him a second time, what do you see? And Jeremiah sees a steaming pot tipped away from the north. And God said, that's right. Guess what that means? From the north, disaster shall break loose on all the inhabitants of the land. I am summoning all the peoples, the kingdoms of the north. They'll come and set up a throne before the gates of Jerusalem. In other words, all the other nations, not the northern kingdom. That's already gone at the time of Jeremiah.
Mhm.
But the Babylonians are coming from the north. And they've got a whole team ready for you. And they will lay siege to Jerusalem. Right? And God says, here's what's been going on in Judea, in the Jewish nation. All their wickedness. They have forsaken me. They've sacrificed to other gods, worshiped the works of their hands. In other words, there's a lot of idolatry going on. And we know what idolatry means, right? Idolatry means child sacrifice, fertility cults, all the ugly things that we associate with idolatry. And so you're going to go talk to these people. And also there's a lot of injustice, but we don't hear that yet. But that's really included in their wickedness. Okay, so gird up your loins, arise and speak to them all that I command you. Do not break down before them, lest I break you before them. In other words, do your job. You're the prophet, right? So from this, what do we learn about Jeremiah at this moment and for the future? Does Jeremiah want to go?
Well, he really doesn't have a choice in all this, it seems.
He does not have a choice, but does he want to go? Does he say, oh, yes, God, send me. I can do this. The heck he does.
No.
Right? He's God, you really want me to do this? First of all, nobody likes the prophet who tells the people that they're all doing the wrong thing. A prophet is only appreciated after he's gone. Right? And usually the prophet is the most hated man of his time because he tells people stuff that they don't want to hear. That's Jeremiah. And the thing that goes along with that, which is very important, is to understand that Jeremiah is at war with his times, right? Now, it's not that Jeremiah doesn't care about his people. On the contrary, he, at the very end of the book, when Jerusalem is destroyed, he goes from denunciation to hope and says, I'm investing in real estate here. I'm going to buy land because I believe you're coming back. And I believe that the exile will end. But nobody likes Jeremiah. Jeremiah is treated as a traitor. And in chapter 20, he curses his faith. I had never heard the Yiddish proverb that Telushkin cites, but it's very appropriate to Jeremiah. He says, truth never dies, but it lives a wretched life. That's what happens with Jeremiah. Jeremiah cares so much about Israel, but he's only appreciated by Israel after his death. Right? I want to go back one step and show you a couple of verses in chapter 9. Right? These are good verses to remember. As Jeremiah says, thus says the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom. Let not the strong man glory in his strength. Let not the rich man glory in his riches, but only in this should one glory, in his earnest devotion to me. For I, the Lord, act with kindness, justice, and equity in the world. In these I delight, declares the Lord. In other words, it's all about kindness. It's all about justice. It's all about fairness. No, you can be wise and you can be evil. You can be strong and you can still be evil. Okay? No, everybody loves a rich man because, as Tevye says, when you're rich, they think you really know, right? What they really know, what they know is they want some of your riches, right? And so they treat you a little differently sometimes. But this is what God cares about, right? And that's the message that we should remember, that we should care about. Right? Some comments or questions relating to Jeremiah?
Why do you think he was so reluctant, Rabbi? Just because it's such a huge task?
Because it's a huge task and he's never going to be popular. In fact, an interesting thing later on, God tells Jeremiah, you don't get to have a family because...
My God, that's terrible.
Yeah, isn't that terrible? Right? But God says, you're going to have a wife and children only for them to be slaughtered in the destruction of Jerusalem.
Well, that's true. I know, but still, what a hard thing to have to bear.
Yep. Yep. So, sometimes you can't say no to God, but who wants to say yes if those are the terms?
Yeah.
Because he didn't tell them
hear
that
you.
at the beginning. That came later. But probably was part of the plan from the beginning, even though Jeremiah didn't hear it.
So did Jeremiah actually write down the book of Jeremiah, or was it scribed later, do you think?
Yeah, interestingly, he had a scribe, and the scribe is mentioned in the book. His name is Baruch, and some of his teachings were destroyed by King Zedekiah. They were thrown into the fire, and Jeremiah just says, Baruch, pick up your pen. We're going to do it again. And so that's how most of his teachings were preserved.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions or comments before we go on to Ezekiel? Boy, everybody's so, you're not going to be that anxious to get to Ezekiel. I promise you, it's going to be very confusing. I mean, so
Most of the, I'm sorry.
yes,
It
Suzanne.
sounds as if most of the prophets, prophecy was something that was imposed on them, not something that they naturally said, oh, I am going to be a prophet.
Yeah, when I grow up, I want to be a prophet.
Exactly. Exactly. Like when I grow up, I want to be well, anyway. And
yeah, I want to be a fireman. I want to be a police.
Right.
I want to be a prophet.
And the whole,
it never happens.
And although the word doesn't necessarily say it, a prophet, of course, is telling people what they don't want to hear and what the prophet himself may not want to say,
Yes.
which sounds a great deal like politics, but I won't go into that.
Yeah.
But I don't think I've ever read a prophet that was like, oh, I want to be a prophet when I grow up.
Yes. So a little bit of a word about prophecy in general. The word prophet in Hebrew is navi. Navi is from the root meaning lahavi, to bring. The prophet is not somebody who prophesies the future, okay? Although sometimes he does. But really what he does is he brings the message, whatever message it is that God wants delivered. That's what he brings. Right? And why would God go to the trouble of sending a messenger with a message? It's not going to be usually because things are so good, because God's coming to tell you, because you guys have been such good servants and so just and so loyal and such kind people, I'm going to send you a prophet to tell you all that. You're not really that good usually. And by the way, it's some people have asked, were the Israelites really that bad in those days? And the answer is, well, it depends. If you compare them to other nations, probably not. If you compare them to, nations which were totally idolatrous and which, lacked a sense of a moral law, then no, the Israelites probably came off reasonably good in comparison to them, certainly not worse. But God says, you're my people. You have a different level of responsibility. And yes, they're evil, but that's not an excuse for you to be evil. Right? Hence the role of the prophet. Not very popular. And think of it this way, if I asked a group of 100 people, name a person in the 20th century who most resembled a biblical prophet, what individual would they name from the 20th century?
Maybe Billy Graham. I mean, the Christians would probably, because he's out,
I don't know about
all
that.
over the
Maybe.
world spreading
Yeah,
the message. I
Suzanne?
don't know.
Jimmy Carter, maybe?
Jimmy Carter? Oh, I doubt that. Wouldn't be a politician. Politician is not a prophet.
Greta
I was thinking
Thunberg.
of him in terms of him saying things that people didn't want to hear.
Well, that's true, but he was so nice about it,
Hmm.
Greta Thunberg.
Greta Thunberg is a 21st century possible prophet.
Sorry.
She's maybe already in business as a prophet, don't you think? But will she be recognized as a prophet in our time?
No.
Probably not until a lot of other bad things have happened, right? Now, the person who is most frequently mentioned as a 20th century prophet is Martin Luther King Jr. Right? That may not be your choice, but that's the choice I hear most frequently. Okay? In his lifetime, Martin Luther King was the most hated man in America because he spoke uncomfortable truths. I mean, you think how uncomfortable talking about racism in America makes a lot of people. They don't even want it discussed in the schools. They don't want a whole lot of talk about, post-slavery racism because it makes people uncomfortable. Well, think how uncomfortable Martin Luther King made a lot of people, especially white people. So that's the unfortunate lot of the prophet. There is an expression in Hebrew, ein navi be'iro, which means there is no prophet in his city. In other words, somebody who tells uncomfortable truths in a certain place, nobody in that place appreciates it. It's only people from other places. And I would argue the same is true with times. Right? There's no prophet in his time.
Mhm.
Okay, so Ezekiel is carried from Jerusalem into exile in Babylonia before the destruction. The destruction is in 586 BCE. He goes when Babylonia first sort of comes to call in about 598. And at that point, Judea says, okay, we will serve you, we will pay taxes to you, we will pay tribute to you. And Babylonia says, yeah, we're also taking some of your big shots. The people who would be most likely to lead a rebellion down the road. Okay? So he is already in Babylonia even before Jerusalem was destroyed. Another interesting thing about Ezekiel is that he was a Kohen. So he had actually done the sacrifices in the temple, and he was intimately acquainted with the temple. So anybody have anything to say about what you read in chapter 1 of Ezekiel?
His vision was interesting, the way he describes it
Yes.
in the very beginning.
Uh-huh. It's quite astonishing, isn't it?
Quite detailed.
Quite detailed and a little bit bizarre. If
Mhm.
if you
Oh,
thought that
very
Isaiah
bizarre.
chapter 6 was interesting, Ezekiel chapter 1 will make your head spin. Okay? Literally. So just to take a couple of excerpts from that. We'll switch back to Ezekiel, right? Chapter 1. So a certain year, we're not sure what he means by the 30th year, or maybe it was he was 30 years old. We don't know. When I was in the community of exiles by a canal, the heavens opened and I saw visions of God. And here's how he tells it. Right? The hand of the Lord came upon him there. I looked, and a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north, a huge cloud and flashing fire surrounded by a radiance. And in the center of it, in the center of the fire, a gleam as of amber. And in the center of that were also the figures of 4 creatures. They had the figures of human beings, but they each had 4 faces and 4 wings. The legs of each were fused into one. The feet were like a single calf's hoof. So they're like, half human, half beast, right? Human hands below their wings, had their faces and their wings on their 4 sides. Each one's wings touching those of the other. Each could move in the direction of any of its faces. So they're like all whirling around. Right? Each had a human face at the front, but each had a face of a lion on the right, face of an ox on the left, and the face of an eagle at the back. Strange creatures. Okay? And each could move in the direction of any of its faces. They went whenever the Spirit impelled them to go, and they didn't turn. Now, I don't get that. All right? If I want to turn right, I have to turn right. I have to turn me to the right.
Mhm.
They go to the right, but they don't turn. That's creepy.
That's kind of weird, huh?
Really, right? And with them was something that looked like burning coals of fire, suggestive of torches. The fire had a radiance. Lightning came out of the fire, and there are flares there, and there's one wheel on the ground next to each of the creatures. And the wheels gleam like these jewels, right? They all have the same form. It's like 2 wheels cutting through each other. How do they move? I don't get it, right? But when they move, each could move in the direction of any of its 4 quarters. They did not veer when they moved, right? And the rims of all 4 were covered all over with eyes, right? They move forward, the wheels move at their sides. When they're born above the earth, the wheels are born too. Wherever the Spirit impelled them to go, that's where they went. And the wheels alongside them. When these moved, these moved. When those stood still, these stood still, etc. Right? And there's a whole gleam of crystal spread out above their heads, right? Etc. And from the expanse over their heads came a sound. When they stood still, they would let their wings droop. It's like, dead stop. Over their heads, a semblance of a throne. And by the way, I like this word, a semblance. Demut is the Hebrew word. A semblance of a throne. In other words, it's not quite as real, but it sure looks real. This is also a sign of religious experience. Okay? And Ezekiel sure has a strange vision here. Right?
Yeah, it's like he's on LSD or something.
Yeah, you
know,
wonder, what did this guy take?
Could you have somebody as an artist try to sculpt it, and as an engineer try to design it so it could work, so it could move in the ways it describes? Other than that, LSD would be my guess.
LSD would do it, I guess. Right? So, but we have no reason to believe that he actually had any of that at his disposal. Right? And so all of this is surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance. Again, it's just a semblance of the presence of the Lord. And when I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. And God says, "O mortal, stand up on your feet, that I may speak to you." And then the Spirit enters him, and he hears what is being spoken to him, etc. And then he's going to be a prophet. That's the beginning of Ezekiel. Okay. We're out of time for tonight. I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit, but we'll talk a little bit more about this experience next week. If you didn't get a chance to look at Ezekiel 1 a little bit more, we'll talk about it some next time. Ashley,
Thank you,
thank you
Rabbi.
for your help.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
Thanks,
We'll see you
Ashley.
next week. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
and
Thanksgiving.
You too.
like a Sunday night. So
Wonderful.
Yes.
filled with
Yes.
holiday season. All
We go
right.
from turkey to latkes.
Turkey to latkes. Amen. Two of my
Good night,
favorites.
everybody.
Good
Good
night.
night.